So I want to welcome you, and so today is going to be the chemistry prize, but before we get to that, I want to remind you of what's coming up, because tomorrow it's artificial intelligence in healthcare, and I just read a very good paper from the Harvard Business School and the Harvard Medical School on the impact of artificial intelligence on healthcare, and it is huge now and growing. So it's probably a good one to know something about. And I happen to know that some of the large ones, like the Mayo Clinic, are heavily involved in this stuff. Something to be aware of. So that's tomorrow too. And then next week, David Elkins is doing, actually the next 2 weeks, economics first, right, David?
Yes.
And then the Peace Prize. Then I'm doing the Medicine Physiology Prize on December the 3rd. And then Val May is really taking on a double load because she's really doing literature, but there are 2 laureates this year, so that's a lot of work. One thing you should be aware of, December the 11th in InfoHealth, Professor Larry Chambers is talking now. He's a prof in Hamilton, but he's moved down here as the research director, and he's made it his mission to look at healthcare for, well, us, looking around the room. And it's brought us since. And I know he's, or at least he claims he's visited somewhere around 30% of the long-term care facilities, but that's only part of it. And I hadn't realized that until I looked at, he sent me some stuff. And one of the points was that in the last 5 years, the number of people 85 and older has increased in Nobel, right here, by 40%. Wow. So is there a message there about long-term care facilities and access to them? I think there's a huge impact. So anyway, well, today we're talking about batteries, and specifically about lithium batteries and how they've really revolutionized portability of the devices that we have. I mean, the common one is the cell phone, but also laptops. And it's an interesting prize because my father was a chemical engineer. One of my best friends is an electrical engineer, the former dean at Western. I actually talked to Peter about this talk because it's right up his alley. I didn't understand 80% of what he said, but anyway, but he's very competent. He got the Lifetime Achievement Award from the IEEE, which is the biggest organization in the world of electrical engineers. So that's quite an achievement for him. But this is an award, when you'll see it as we march through it, it's clearly been an incremental thing. I mean, it's very typical of what I've witnessed with engineers. Careful, dare I say, plodding sometimes, steps to achieve goals, and you'll see that that's what's happened here. By the way, we're really talking about work that's a long time ago. All 3 people here got the Nobel Prize for stuff they did in the 70s through the 90s. So obviously the Nobel Committee looked at an aggregate of work and said, how is this actually panned out? But what I'm talking about is not all the new stuff. I'll allude to some of that, but things have clearly happened in the last 15 or 20 years since their last stuff. So now I do want to correct something, because one person pointed out I kept calling Peebles Pebbles last week, and I looked back at my stuff and it actually misspelled a couple of times, despite the fact that the award thing had it right, so I apologize for that. But this kind of incremental, I mean, these Nobel Prizes aren't awarded for cognitive talents, but the products of those talents, right? And getting back to Albert Einstein that I talked about last week, what are the two things that he cherished most? Curiosity and imagination. Curiosity and imagination. Well, I don't think that won this Nobel Prize. But you'll see something that was really quite creative last year. And the prize, that's not demeaning the prize. It means that there are certain things that can only be resolved incrementally, step by step. And that's what we're going to witness here. But there aren't any thought experiments here. No Einstein thought experiments. Well, the logo here, wind on the left. This, by the way, is my pointer today. Yardstick. Yes, yardstick. Oh, Kresge's out of business now. Right. Maybe I'll be out of business. But anyway, solar and wind and wave energy stored in a device, and that's when it really comes right down to this. This is not about our iPhones and our portable computers. It's about the environment. After all, I'm going to the end of this talk to make this point, but what's the point of electric cars if you go out and generate the energy with fossil fuels? Where's the win there? And there are some other negatives about these batteries too. The use of cobalt and manganese, both of them toxins. One of the first patients I ever saw at the Toronto General Hospital had a very disabling movement disorder, and he had been a miner somewhere in South America, but mining manganese. And but that's the big point. That's if we can develop a safe storage device that can store enough of this periodic or kind of source of energy through the wind and sun and wave and whatever other sources we have, and hold on to it, to store it, then we can power cities. That's the important thing. That's what to keep our minds focused on in this talk. It's not about iPhones. So let's just move along. By the way, the conversation after last week's talk was fascinating because some of you came up to me and it made me think, gee, there should actually be a blog site for this stuff because it is really interesting material. And many of the people in the audience actually, let's face it, we're all seniors, we all have experience, and a lot of it is really worthwhile. And so it's worthwhile sharing. So there they are. How would you like a name good enough? And Whittingham and Kira Yoshino. And there are the three. Good enough is 95, I think, 95. Lucky enough to have survived to win the prize because I've said before, there are no posthumous awards for Nobel Prizes, so you better hang on. Interestingly enough, these two, not Whittingham, but the other two, in the run-up to the Nobel Prize, there's usually some clue that something's coming. They win some other award. Well, they won the top award from the IEEE, that International Engineering Prize. And next week is, I think, if you want imagination and curiosity, next week, you're gonna see it. And they got the Laskin Prize 3 years before. The documentation around it is virtually identical. So clearly the Nobel Committee pays attention to what's happened with these candidates. Who else has vetted them before? So I think that's worthwhile knowing. Now, but let's look at last year. This is the one, Francis Arnold. Talk about imagination. She certainly had it, maybe not so much the other two, but I'm just going to briefly describe that because, well, here's what they look like, and that's Francis. You can almost tell that he's from Cambridge. There's a certain look, isn't there? I mean, and interesting enough, the awards this year, about 2 out of 3 are American, and the other third are, at least in the sciences, are UK people. And they spend significant amounts of time in both places, and 2 of them in Switzerland. So what was the issue? Back in the 1980s, she was doing what a lot of other biochemists, she's an engineer by training, were trying to do because they were trying to develop a handy tool for detoxifying the environment, for destroying certain chemicals. And how to do that? Well, one of the ways is to use an organic enzyme, something to break it down. Well, how do you actually develop an enzyme that won't do that job and not leave more harm than good? Well, one of the ways, the kind of top-down approach, is to say, well, gee, we know enough about how enzymes work here, so let's just build it like Lego style, and we'll patch in, we'll develop a gene that will create a certain protein, desired protein, that will have the desired sequences of amino acids in it, okay? That's the idea. It's hopeless. I mean, much past 100 amino acids in a link, it's a crapshoot trying to figure that out. So she had, her bright idea was to say, let's turn evolution loose on this. Let's see what evolution can do, what she called controlled or directed evolution. And so what she did is her marker enzyme, I don't know what that enzyme did, but what she did is she took the gene that created that protein, enzymes are proteins, okay, and she created random mutations in that gene. And then she inoculated bacteria with that DNA, those mutant genes, and of course she got mutant proteins or mutant enzymes, a variety of them. And then she tried them out to see which ones worked more effectively than others. So this is from the Nobel thing. Just follow me through that. This is a really clever idea because no one else stumbled on it. So here is this is a figure here. There's the gene, okay, the double helix here. So she introduces random mutations in it. So there are 3 random variants, but there might have been 100. Okay, but 3 here. Then she inserts that DNA into the bacteria, which will then create the requisite proteins directed by those mutant genes or enzymes. And then she simply tries them out on whatever target she's trying to destroy in a petri dish of a sort. And the ones that didn't work go to the trash heap. And then she takes the winners and she runs them through the cycle several times, just repeats it again and again. And the enzyme became hundreds of times more effective. It's a really clever idea, letting evolution figure it out with some oversight. I think that's what turned me on last year when I saw this. I thought, gee, this is not an idea everyone would come up with. Well, they didn't. And one of the others, George Smith, well, I'll just show you the figure. this is not as clever an idea, but it's a good one. What he thought was, well, he wanted to develop antibodies to certain proteins expressed on cancer cell membranes. So those proteins literally stick out of the membrane, and they have a certain configuration that white blood cells can recognize or antibodies can recognize. So how do you sort out which antibodies are the ones that you want? Well, he used these phage viruses. They're amongst the simplest of viruses. I mean, they're really just DNA with an envelope around them. And so he inserted the gene for whatever protein product he wanted, and inserted it into the very simple kind of a single, well, it literally is a loop, a closed loop here, into the virus, and the virus very nicely expresses that protein product right on the tail here. Very convenient. Then all you have to do is expose a mix of these antibody candidates to this protein, and you know which antibodies you want, right? You can figure it out. It's a clever idea, but I'll bet others had similar ideas, but that wasn't the case with the previous example. So I'll go a little bit further. So the lithium battery, we'll just move along here. Here are the three fellows. There's Good Enough, University of Texas in Austin. Ashino, he's worked for a corporation. At the time the work was done in the 90s, he was working for a corporation. Sometimes a bit of a no-no in science, but he was, and did the major part of this. And Stanley Whittingham here at State University of New York, that's where he is now, so he's close at hand. So let's just move along. Now, what I'm going to do, here's the wind generation and aircraft now. Now I get this because I get the trade magazine for aviation in progress, and I can tell you almost every issue has some aircraft, hybrid or pure electric-driven aircraft. Why? For city traffic, not for intercity traffic, but within a city, like helicopters, but except they're much more efficient. So they can land like a STOL aircraft or a helicopter thing, but once they're up, tilt the props, and then away they go. And there are a lot of companies involved with this. And there's a real future in this. There's one of the car batteries for a car. All right, now, I put up the references up here because if you didn't before, if you ever want to know anything from the Nobel thing, just look up nobelprize.org. That's the mother site for anything you might want to know. And they're very good. The interviews, I think, are often a huge plus. Nothing better than having the expert himself or herself explain it to you. And the interviews aren't long, but they're quite good. Now these are people used to being interviewed, but they're quite good. Particularly if you get them two or three of them and they don't quite agree on something. To see the exchange, and they're quite diplomatic, and the Nobel ceremony, and then they usually give a simplified summary for the newspapers and media, and then they give a proper background scientific paper, usually about 10 or 20 pages, and that has all the references. So it's actually a very good site. Now here's Good Enough. in just last year, how we made the lithium-ion rechargeable battery. I'll tell you, it's almost unintelligible. Then he manages to be unintelligible at a single page. Here's the alarming one. 10 years left to redesign the lithium-ion battery. We're living on borrowed time. Why on borrowed time? Because the demand for lithium-ion batteries is soaring, and there's a limited supply. And furthermore, many of them, as now constituted, include manganese and cobalt, the very thing we don't want. So it's not environmentally the most friendly thing, and it's one of the things the Nobel Committee, and I'm sure David will comment on this next week, but they're very conscious of the environmental movement. I think it influences some of their decisions on awards. That's probably why the directed evolution won, because I saw that as a way of breaking down toxins in the environment. Well, for any battery, what would your objective? It's always good to have your objectives laid out. I mean, what should drive the design of any battery? Well, the smaller the size and the lighter it is, the better. And especially the storage capacity should be as large as you can get. And because there are so many cycles, probably hundreds, if not thousands, I just think, I recharge mine once a day at least, so there's 300, phone life has what, about 3 years, so there's 1,000 cycles right there plus. And reduce the cost. Here's one that you don't hear talked about: reduce the harm to the environment and employees. That's cobalt and manganese. No one actually thinks about that. It's not out in the public domain. And increase the safety of the battery. That's been a problem with lithium from the get-go. And so, now lithium's interesting, isn't it? I mean, last week we were talking about the universe. We were talking about the Big Bang, and the first several 100,000 years after the Big Bang. Well, guess what was around, we think, very early in the game, probably within the first few minutes? Lithium. Hydrogen and helium. Those are the three that have the oldest birthdays, the longest, the most ancient of the elements. All the other elements were created by stars collapsing, supernova, right? And so in the periodic table, only 3 were created in the original. Not much lithium, but some. And it's interesting that all 3 are the simplest. So in this case, 3 protons, 3 electrons. It has 2 orbits, 2 electrons in the inner orbit and 1 on the outside. This is very good for any battery to have a donor for electrons, and an easy donor. This one's handing out cash, meaning electrons, at the drop of a hat without any effort. But that's also the problem, because it's what makes it dangerous. Sometimes we talk about that a little bit. So it's an electron donor, a very willing donor. And so what did Whittingham do so many years ago, back in the early 1970s? I think the main paper was 1975, and he was working for Exxon at the time. So what did he bring to the table? Well, he caught on to the idea of the potential for lithium, because no one else had it until that time. It was light and gave up an electron quite easily. And for the other electrode, the cathode, he used layered titanium disulfide. Now, as it turns out, in retrospect, it wasn't a very clever idea to do this, but it worked. And and I'll show you what happens here. Now, these are, I like it when yeah, yes?
What did that mean, produce whiskers of lithium? And on your previous slide,
Oh,
just the terminology.
yeah, where was that?
What charge?
Oh, the whiskers?
Yes.
Oh, we're gonna show you that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's a secret. Yeah, good point. Now, it's really nice when you can take the figures out of the Nobel Institute. So all of these figures now are from the Nobel's publications. Okay, I can tell you that they don't look quite the same if you go to the IEEE site. But let's just stick to what the authorities have done, all right? So here's the battery. Battery has three elements. It has two poles, an anode and a cathode, and it has an electrolyte in between here, all right? And an external circuit here. So in this case, a light bulb or a meter, whatever it is, that's a load on the system. Because lithium gives up its electron very easily, away goes the electron, the E here, through the circuit and returns back to the cathode here, leaving lithium, the lithium ion, not lithium, but the lithium ion minus its one electron. And the lithium ion migrates to the cathode. That's what happens. That's the basic circuit of the battery. He used pure lithium. Not a good thing. But at least he, proof of concept, and at this time, oil prices crashed. It was expensive. The company said, gee, why are we developing electrical, or why are we developing these batteries when oil prices are way, way down? So they ditched it. And so that's the last we heard of Whittingham in this story. Move along to, oh, here's the whiskers. What happens is that with this movement of the lithium from one side of the, well, from the negative side of the battery, the anode here, over to the cathode here, those lithium ions kind of form little, what are they called in caves, daguerreotypes or whatever they are? Anyway, things like that. Yeah, but they form fingers, or what they call whiskers. That would be all right, except that some of them get so long that they actually puncture the other end of the battery and create a short circuit, and boom, flames, or maybe even an explosion. So that was a no-go, and it wasn't solved even by the next iteration of the battery, which is good enough. Except, as I said here, it wasn't good enough. Yeah. So what did he bring to the table here? Well, he wasn't happy with that disulfide cathode. And so he thought, well, we'll use layered metal oxides here. Well, guess what metals were oxidized? The stuff that we don't want, the cobalt and the manganese. Okay. However, at least this battery generated twice the voltage, and it had a higher capacity. But it was still subject to those whiskers. And so a limited number of recycle times. And here they are, cobalt and manganese were used to stabilize the cathode. It may have stabilized the cathode, but these are toxic metals. So it wasn't good enough. Now, enter, wait a minute. Well, you don't need to see that because we've gone through it. So, Ishino improved the safety. This is the safety. Didn't reduce it to zero, but it certainly improved it. He eliminated the pure lithium because lithium is so reactive on its own. And what he did is he embedded the lithium ions within layers of carbon in a peculiar mixture, a petroleum cake. I guess it was something, an industry byproduct, but it seemed to do the job. It was cheap, and it stabilized these lithium ions somewhat. And he also protected the carbon surface here by adding this ethylene carbonate. But he retained good enough's cathode was good enough for him. So still the same problem with cobalt and manganese. Still, he's doubled the energy stored, the voltage is doubled, and no more whiskers. So significant improvements, but that's where we're talking about the 90s, and especially Japan. Okay, so it's a stable, high capacity battery generating 4 volts and no whiskers. Well, I've already said that, so plus. Well, you can refine this, can't you? I mean, he had this kind of make-do carbon source here to kind of stabilize those lithium ions, but you can do better. Now, this slide got in the middle of here, but it just gives you some idea of where we're at. Here's the efficiency or the power of a Nissan Leaf, and the Tesla model here. So the Tesla model, the batteries, is a little bit better, not a lot better. This is where they think they might be able to get with the lithium-ion battery, but I think my sense from reading the literature is that there's a very real concern that without something really new or innovative, we're kind of reaching the peak of what we can tweak chemically. That there isn't much room left for improvement. And if we're thinking about storing enough energy for a city, we might have to go to an entirely different model. And so the last 2 decades, well, it's still around 4 volts. The cost has come down a lot. The energy capacity's gone up. But this is what I just said. Progress is slowing as conventional technologies, which I just outlined, reach fundamental limits. And again, the problem of cobalt and nickel and manganese as elements. Some people have suggested, well, gee, why? There's a lot of iron in the earth. Most of the core of the earth is iron. And lots of copper, although you wouldn't know it by the expense of copper for pipes. And, but still, a lot cheaper than cobalt and nickel and without the toxicity of those. So, and other things you don't need to, I don't need to know this and you don't need to know it, but people continuing to, here's the kind of the general map. This is, the most important part of this is the projection of where this lithium ion battery is going, that it's going to reach there's a limit somewhere, whether it's up here or down here, but there's a limit. Now, your car battery is way down here. So it's a significant improvement over what we've got in our car to start it. So where to now? I'm going to change direction here a little bit, because the one of the big concerns is the biggest concern I think is the environmental one. One of the issues is that demand will simply outstrip the supply. For cobalt, projections are that we'll reach that level in 10 years or 11 years, and another 10 years for nickel.
Wow.
So, and this technology is being used to selling more and more electric cars or vehicles. And China is now running buses, large public vehicles with lithium battery as the source of their energy. So if that continues, and India, so that's one issue. The other one is that cobalt has everywhere. There are certain places where it makes some sense to mine it. And unfortunately, at least over 50% of the world's supply comes from a very unstable and nasty place. The Democratic Republic of the Congo. Guess who's injecting money into
China.
the Democratic Republic of the Congo?
China.
China. Why do you think China's been heavy into Africa? For strategic reasons, for economic reasons, and because they don't judge anyone. And whatever happens, turn a blind eye.
Yeah.
As long as we get our cobalt out. Australia's the next, but way back, and very expensive to mine it off the deep sea floor. Nickel production, I grew up thinking that Canada was the largest producer. Maybe it was at one time, but still dominated by a dozen countries, and there are some of them in difficult places. New Caledonia, not and Indonesia, maybe not such great places to mine. I don't know, but anyway, because the current battery design includes these, I think we're creating a problem, both there and for us. I mean, what happens to the stuff in the dump sites?
Yeah.
Now, these are car manufacturer estimates, so we can pretty much trash them, except that they do see, I mean, companies do forecasts. I mean, certainly the European manufacturers, Mercedes, BMW, are the two big ones. They clearly see this coming, at least in Europe. And, but look at this, for a 100-kilogram cathode, that's a lot of cobalt and a lot of nickel. What happens to that stuff when the batteries run out, or I don't know.
Can it be reused, the cobalt?
I don't know. And these, I don't know what to do when somebody says 200,000 tons of cobalt per year. I don't know what that means. I presume it means a lot. But these are toxins, so it's not. Well, you don't need to see that. Well, there they are. And so just reminding you. But so I think the real issue with this battery stuff, to go back to the beginning of this talk, there isn't any eureka moment in this battery story. It's obviously an incremental path, and it continues on, and they haven't really figured it out, and we don't really know where the limits are of the current technology, except that probably we're approaching those limits. And on the way to there, we've incorporated metals, some of which are toxic, and we have no plan for disposing of them properly. So that's a big concern, especially if we're thinking in any way of responsibly providing the power for all of our electric vehicles. So that's my take on this subject. I think that's the most important thing I learned, because I wasn't aware of those metals and how important they were in these battery cycles. And I don't think they were. I mean, if you think about it, back in the 70s and 80s, I don't know that Whittingham was even thinking much about a market, or Exxon at that time. Certainly, Shino in Japan, yes, because Toshiba got involved. And, but still, the market was way down, or hardly developed. So this incremental story, yes, they've singled out 3 people. Listen, if we could do justice in this situation, we'd be probably giving awards to whole departments and multiple people. Certainly, the story didn't end in the 1990s. For sure it hasn't ended, and people are making significant contributions. So what stands out here any more than the later developments? And it just closed the door on anyone getting rewarded for high caliber work on batteries later. I don't know. I do think though, and this is an aside point, I don't think most laureates that I have any knowledge of do their work thinking about the Nobel Prize. I think at some point, obviously when you get these early awards, it becomes, well, there's a bit of a flag up, gee. But I don't think people, when they do the work, I don't think they're thinking about the prize. The one time I was unsettled, and I mentioned it last week, was the cosmic background radiation stuff. And the group at MIT in the United States, I mean, they have a very large hall there, so any major big dignitary coming through to give a big talk, that's where it's done. And they held a celebratory meeting there, really to celebrate who was going to get the Nobel Prize, their guys, over their analysis of the cosmic background radiation. And then Nature and Science both had to retract within a month or 6 weeks because they were red-faced about it. And because Max Planck pulled the rug and said, gee, that's artifact. Why didn't they go to the Max Planck and really settle that one before? I would think it would have been why. But what I'm saying, I think that's unusual. I think that from what I can understand, and certainly in the narrow area of neuroscience that I know, the people who won Nobels in the 60s and 70s and 80s that I know, it was certainly no part of their reputation as far as a career went. There certainly was a small club of people who knew one another very well, and it was at least in my days, it was quite a small club. You could number them on both hands and feet and have a few toes and fingers left over. And they had been mentors for one another at various times, and they shared stuff, and they were quite generous. But the Nobel stuff didn't play big. And it's not even a big award, is it? I mean, what is it, $1 million or just short of $1 million? Today's change, especially when you're sharing it with 2 other people, is that going to change your life? I don't think so. Any questions or thought? Yes.
2 questions. Do you remember, I don't know whether you're old enough or not, remember
I'm not, definitely not.
big breakthrough of the Cobalt bomb in London, Ontario,
yeah.
treating cancer? Whatever happened to all of that, and was it so toxic that it was ruled out eventually?
I don't know the answer to that.
And the second question,
I remember the bomb, the Cobalt bomb in London, Ontario. You remember that?
Yeah. Anyhow, the second question, I was told that the Toyota company was not going to be making any electric cars. They were working on battery, and was it a hydrogen battery?
Well, hydrogen is the source of their energy,
Yes.
right? Like petrol in your tank.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the beauty about that is the only byproduct is water. Yeah, and
what's happening with that?
Yeah, well, it gets to what's the big hang-up? If you live in Toronto or you live in London, England, that is, if you drive in London, England, or any large place, well, there'll probably be places the company would kind of establish, 50 or 100 refueling places. But what do you do with the rest of the UK? Or Europe? I mean, your range is down now to the next fuel site. Now, you remember Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was the governor of California? Yeah, he was big on hydrogen cells, and I think there was a chain of them put in maybe to keep his vehicles going. But there obviously is a threshold beyond which, I mean, even now with the electric car, I'm seriously thinking about it now. But the range, I mean, even if they get to 500 or 800 kilometers, where do I drive? Well, I drive to New England. That's at the end of the thing. I gotta get there before the battery goes out. And don't forget that many of these batteries are temperature dictated, right? Just like the battery in your car. The power goes down by about a half. So maybe it's 800 kilometers, 500 miles in California in sun and reasonable things. Under a perfect world, it's like the smart cars with lane detection devices, but you need eyes that can actually see. There isn't a misted windshield or something covering up, or snow confusing the thing, or getting in the way of your sensors. But the hydrogen one it makes a lot of sense, right?
It does, Bill, until you realize we live in freezing temperatures. Can you imagine?
Yeah. Yes.
That's the downside.
Well, that's why I'm not going that route. Yes.
Isn't lithium used in a medical sense for depression or?
It is. It is. And they don't get whiskers. Sorry, bad pun.
Where does that come from? And why do they call it lithium?
Well, it's not lithium of lithium metal.
Oh, okay, no.
Yeah, and so
Why does it have
you're
the
not
same
being
name?
treated with a battery.
Sometimes those depressions need a little battery charge.
Yeah, yeah.
It's the
But
bipolar.
but it's quite effective in smoothing out the ups and downs.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. Anything else? Yeah,
The thing with these batteries,
yeah,
first of all, when people talk about electric cars being, carbon neutral, or what do they call it?
Tesla.
There's no pollution.
yeah, carbon.
That's not true.
Yeah.
Because it's out of the tailpipe, if you will, that they're zero emission. But there's all the electricity that has to be generated to charge the batteries.
Exactly.
And every time you go through a process, when you charge the battery, you lose energy, about
Yeah.
20%. When you
Yeah.
discharge the battery, you lose 20%. When the motor turns, you lose another 20%. So the amount of total energy you're losing in that whole process is incredible that they don't measure. Lithium batteries, when they burn, also can't be put out by any fire department on the planet. A Tesla caught on fire and it couldn't be extinguished until it extinguishes the car and everything in it. The only way you can extinguish a lithium battery fire is by submerging it completely in liquid.
Yeah, it's a little like magnesium in that regard, right?
Exactly.
And,
Yeah.
yeah.
And how many power generating stations are we gonna need to power all of these cars? Nobody's talked about that either. And where is the technology going to be? Is it gonna be nuclear, coal, oil, or what?
Well, the problem in the US and China, the two biggest consumers, and India running up a third, is guess where the energy's coming from? Coal,
Cool.
for now. So they may be building some hydroelectric power, but down there in the 5% or 10%, or even if they're putting in nuclear plants.
That's really bad.
So,
I've heard that there are 1,800 coal plants in the process of coming online in the Far
yeah,
East.
the one thing where there could be a major revolution is if they develop fusion,
That's right.
the energy source of the sun,
Yeah,
because there are no pollutants. It's clean.
that's right.
Yeah.
And the problem is getting powerful enough magnets and controlling. France, I think, has one. I think there are maybe two other countries that are trying to develop them. But again, with the perspective of time, imagine where we were 100 years ago. That's why I put this slide up last week, to remind us of the need for some perspective, that things could dramatically change. I get the sense with lithium-ion batteries that this is yesterday's solution. And we're not really gonna have a major impact on that aspect of the climate change, without an alternative source. You know, one of the alarming things, I don't know whether you, just looking in there was a section in the, I hate to keep quoting this one, but in the New York Times, in their weekend section, on the rate of change of climate. And that most of the people involved in this, the Al Gores, et cetera, the public face of it, even they were rather conservative. I mean, he's kind of a mouthpiece for stuff, but nonetheless. But now, it seems to have accelerated, or certainly been vastly underestimated. And we saw part of that at work in the summer, didn't we, with Greenland? You know, I have two kids, a son-in-law and a daughter in Alaska. Gee, there's no snow up there yet. And glaciers are almost gone. And look at Greenland, and now it's not just the western side of Antarctica that's going, it's the east side, which is even larger. And sea ice, in a way, holds back these glaciers. Well, the sea ice is going. So now the stuff is just kind of sliding into the ocean. So worst case, I guess they're talking about 200 inches of ocean going up. But the trouble is when water warms, it expands. So that adds to the depth. But more than that, it also becomes acidic, right? Because of the carbon dioxide, the CO2 emissions. And that, gee, just talk to somebody, I have a relative whose whole career was on the Australian Great Barrier Reef. About 80% of it's been wiped out, gone white through acidification. Now, it's out of sight, out of mind. You don't see it until some special comes on, usually on PBS or BBC, but it won't be any other network that might be more sympathetic to it. But I think it's a huge problem, and we're playing catch up and very late in the game. Are you good? Well, I shouldn't ask David about that, but anyway. So, any other thoughts? Now, we're kind of at the end of this, right? I mean, we're never gonna see 100 inches or 50 inches of rising stuff, maybe even 20 or 10, I don't know. But our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, yeah, that's all within this century, I think.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. Imagine New York. What was the hurricane that went through? No, but I'm trying to think of the name. The one that, there's a lot of water in the subway system. Yeah. Well, that was what? That was what, 2 feet? A foot and a half or 2 feet of water? Well, we're talking about something a lot more than that. Look what would happen to London, England, and New York, and Hong Kong. Almost any major coastal city. It'd be a huge problem, and it's becoming a fisheries problem, right? Because as Martha pointed out to me the other day, she's the daughter up in Alaska, she said, well, you know, the seals up there, they depend on getting on a float to rest. And there are no floats. They're working all the time. And dying off.
And the polar bears.
And the polar bears, yeah. Yeah, so, anything else? Now, next week, remember the Info Health Fund, but next week is it's very interesting. I've had, in the 2 years, the most struggle with this one, because it was really not in my ballpark at all, but it's really interesting. It's a very interesting prize, which I was blind to, by some quite interesting people. So you might want to take that one in. And very fine people. Now, most of these people are very fine people, but the three next week are paragons of virtue in many ways, so. So that, anyway, so if you wanna see three paragons of virtue, come next week. Okay, so, that's it. And, if you have time, I know it's a bit much with the info health, but the AI stuff is really, it's really very important. Yeah, it is. Again, is it going to impact us? Maybe not much, but, you know, but it's certainly where it's going, including robots in clinics, believe it or not. So, who are better than psychiatrists at identifying depressed people? Because of the sophisticated facial recognition software that can pick up nuances in facial expression that go with different moods. And the physician sitting there typing stuff into the computer, not looking at the patient. Yeah, so anyway, so.
Nexus is
yeah.
going to that.
What's that?
Nexus,
Yes.
you'll be identified by facial.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Next time you go to the airport.
Oh, that's right,
Mhm.
that's right, isn't it? Yeah, facial
I
recognition.
think it's already started in Vancouver.
But iPhones are that way, or aren't smartphones that way now? The option, the fingerprint and also, face
The
recognition.
newer ones, yeah.
Yeah, the newer ones, yeah. Just don't get a haircut because it changes. Okay, so, hopefully we'll see some of it tomorrow, but it's good fun.